In the previous discussion, we look at the how an individual investor would behave in deciding how much of the wealth should be held in terms of money and how much should be held in terms of bonds. Okay, so just to highlight few things, just remember that each individual investor will have their own expectation of the normal interest rate. Okay, and each individual will have different normal interest rates. Okay, so I might say it's 10%, so you might say it's 9%, so all of us will have a different way how to calculate this. But however, if we try to collect all of these individual investors, we can somehow try to come up with the aggregate demand for speculative money. Okay, so because everyone would basically have the same behavior. When interest rate is too high, we would like to hold bonds more than money, and when interest rate is too low, we would prefer to hold money compared to bonds. Okay, so if we can somehow try to sum up all those individual graphs, we should be able to come up with this aggregate demand for speculative money. Okay, so if we look here, when interest rate is so high, okay, so everyone would expect that interest rate is too high above the normal interest rate. So most probably interest rate will then go down. So when interest rate goes down, price of bonds will go up. When price of bond goes up, people will expect capital gain. Okay, so capital gain is profitable. So in that case, people will like to hold bonds more than money. So in this case, when interest rate is high, you would like to hold bonds more than money. So the demand for money will be very small. Okay, and the same, the opposite is true when interest rate is too low. When interest rate is too low, okay, lower than the normal or lower than the critical interest rate, people will then expect interest rate to go up. Okay, so when interest rate goes up, price will go down, so people will expect to get capital loss. Okay, so capital loss not good, so it would be more more profitable to hold money, because if you hold bonds, you will suffer capital loss. Okay, so in that case, the demand for bonds will be low while the demand for money would be high. Okay, you would prefer to hold money more. Okay, so if you just look at this towards the end of the speculative demand, the aggregate speculative demand for money, the curve will then approach a horizontal line. This is what we call the liquidity trap. Okay, liquidity trap means that when the interest rate is too low, what we are observing currently in the United States, the interest rate is too low. So people would always expect that, okay, now it is too low, almost near to zero, or too low. So obviously interest rate will then go up. Okay, so when people expect interest rate to go up, holding bonds then will lead to capital loss. In this case, people will always prefer to hold money. Okay, basically there will be an infinite demand for money. In this case, bonds are no longer being demanded, basically. Okay, so just take note, how the relationship between money and interest rate. Okay, so by now you should already realize of a negative relationship between interest rate and the demand for money. Okay, so in that case, you should already know how a change in money, okay, will then affect interest rate, which in the end will affect income. Now we can combine all these different motives for holding money into one function. Okay, so the first one, we know that the first two reasons for holding money, the transaction demand for money and precautionary demand for money, are somehow independent of interest rate. They are not affected by interest rate according to Keynes. So the only determinant will be income. So M1, which is the transaction and precautionary demand for money, is a positive function of income. So as you have more income, you will spend more transaction. You will demand more money for transactional purposes. So that's why we kind of observe a vertical line, okay, which the transaction and precautionary demand for money is independent of interest rate. Okay. However, the speculative demand for money, based on our previous discussion, is a negative function of interest rate. Okay, so it is downward sloping. Okay, so lower interest rate will then make more demand for speculative money, while a higher interest rate means less demand for money. You would prefer to hold bonds. Okay, so we can combine these two and then come up with the general function that represent the demand, the total demand for money. We can combine these three reasons, okay, the three different demands for money, okay, into one function, which is the total demand for money. MD is a function of two variables, income and interest rate. So the demand for money is positively affected by income. Okay, however, it has a negative relation with regard to interest rates. Okay, so when we draw a graph, okay, to explain the relationship between income and the demand for money, we observe a downward sloping curve. Okay, a downward sloping total demand for money curve. Okay, so in other words, we can come up with this equation, a simple equation, okay, that explain the relationship between these two variables and money demand. So we can just assume a simple linear function, a simple linear equation, where the demand for money is positively affected by income. So C1 is positive, C is just a coefficient, and C2, okay, the coefficient for interest rate is negative. Okay, so as interest rate goes up, the demand for money will go down. Okay.